Have you ever looked at your blood relatives and realized you are just a human ATM? They thought I was merely the boring daughter in the shadows cleaning up their messes. But they forgot one basic rule. When you are the architect of their kingdom, you know exactly which pillar to wire with explosives. The loudest laughers always fall the hardest, and I am about to show you how a 2-page legal document demolished a 30-year perfect illusion. Hello, wonderful audience of Haley Revenge Stories, and thank you so sincerely for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can provide our hardworking staff with the funds they need to cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. My name is Chloe Reynolds. I am 32 years old, and my official title is Lead Risk Manager at Aegis Vanguard Solutions. In the corporate world, my firm is the ultimate shield. We specialize in corporate crisis management. In simple terms, I am the person that mega corporations call in an absolute panic when they are facing catastrophic public relations disasters worth tens of millions of dollars. I operate with a relentlessly cold head and a sharply tuned logical mind. Panic is a luxury I strictly do not afford myself, and untangling massive high-stakes disasters is literally my daily routine. I am exceptionally well compensated because I never let emotion cloud my judgment when the ship is sinking. Yet despite my stellar professional record and my fierce independence, the dynamic within my own family is entirely different. At home, I am completely invisible. I am not the golden child. I am the designated silent garbage collector. While I build impenetrable walls of security for Fortune 500 companies during the day by night, I secretly provide the financial foundation for my older brother Julian and my younger sister Stella. Julian walks around wearing designer suits, calling himself a visionary tech chief executive officer, but in reality he is just a parasite burning through cash with absolutely zero viable product to show for his efforts. Stella, on the other hand, is a lifestyle influencer completely lost in her own delusions of grandeur, faking a luxurious life for strangers on the internet. They both stand on a glamorous stage that is built entirely by my hidden money and my spotless credit score. This miserable truth brings us directly to the setting of tonight. The event was an obscenely lavish dinner party hosted to celebrate the grand launch of Stella's brand new cosmetics line. The venue was a rented private hall dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with expensive imported white roses. It was a picture-perfect upper-class gathering designed to impress shallow investors. What none of the wealthy, influential guests in the room knew was that I was the one who had quietly secured all the agonizing business licenses behind the scenes. I was the one who paid the commercial rent in cold cash when her initial backers suddenly backed out. But where was I seated for this grand celebration? I was shoved into the farthest, darkest corner of the long dining table. Wearing a simple navy dress, I looked completely out of place and entirely neglected among the sea of glittering designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. I was merely the ghost haunting their glamorous banquet meant to be seen only when a bill needed paying. The evening dragged on agonizingly, a tedious parade of clinking crystal glasses and hollow networking conversations. The tension in the room reached its absolute climax just as the extravagant gold leaf desserts were being served by the waitstaff. My mother had been drinking premium champagne for over 3 hours. Her face was visibly flushed with the arrogant warmth of alcohol and absolute unearned smugness. She leaned back heavily in her velvet chair, looked across the length of the long table right into my eyes, and delivered a casual, deeply cruel joke. "I wish you were never born, Chloe. Our family's life would be so perfect if it was just Julian and Stella." She said it loudly. She said it clearly enough for the entire room of VIP guests to pause and hear. And the absolute worst part was not the venomous comment itself, but what immediately followed it. The entire dining table erupted into genuine roaring laughter. Julian slapped the heavy mahogany wood in pure amusement, his face red with joy. Stella covered her mouth, giggling uncontrollably as if it was the funniest, most brilliant punchline she had ever heard in her life. Even my father, the supposedly dignified patriarch of this grand illusion, simply smiled a wide, toothy grin and raised his champagne flute in silent, approving agreement. It was a brutal public execution of my dignity broadcasted live to a room full of esteemed guests who were now looking at me with pity and amusement. In that moment, they expected me to shrink into myself. They expected me to look down at my lap, maybe shed a pathetic tear, or quietly excuse myself to go cry in the venue's restroom. They expected the weak, compliant Chloe who always took the emotional hits to keep the delicate family peace intact. But I did not cry. I did not show a single ounce of weakness. I gently, deliberately placed my silver dessert fork down on the fine porcelain plate. The sharp metallic clink sounded incredibly loud in my own ears, cutting through the fading laughter. In that exact fraction of a second, my brain entirely bypassed all emotional distress and immediately activated into high-alert crisis management mode. I was no longer a hurt, rejected daughter seeking validation. I was the lead risk manager at Aegis Vanguard Solutions, and I was looking directly at a massive liability that desperately needed to be neutralized permanently. I looked slowly around the table, making brief, piercing eye contact with the flushed, laughing faces of my so-called family members. I offered them a slow, measured smile. It was the kind of smile that is perfectly polite on the surface, but absolutely never reaches the eyes. The cruel laughter around me began to falter and die out as they finally noticed my frozen expression. The lavish table grew uncomfortably, chillingly quiet. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my posture impeccably straight, and delivered one short, crisp sentence. I guess everyone will really love what I'm going to do next. Without waiting for a single gasp or verbal response, I stood up gracefully from my chair, smoothed out the front of my simple navy dress, and walked right out the heavy oak doors, leaving the absolute ruins of their laughter echoing in the silence behind me. The drive back to my luxury high-rise condominium in the downtown financial district took exactly 28 minutes. I navigated the sleek streets of the city with mechanical precision. I did not shed a single tear during the entire ride. I did not scream, and I did not grip the steering wheel in blinding anger. Crying is a biological response to unexpected loss, and frankly, as I analyzed the situation, I realized I had lost absolutely nothing of value. I parked my car in my reserved spot, took the private elevator straight up to the 34th floor, and walked directly into my impeccably organized home office. I bypassed the decorative bookshelves and went straight to the heavy wall safe hidden discreetly behind a modern canvas painting. I punched in the 8-digit security code. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. Inside the dark compartment there were no nostalgic photo albums, no sentimental childhood drawings, and absolutely no cherished family keepsakes. I am a corporate risk manager. I do not keep memories. I keep hard, undeniable, heavily audited evidence. I pulled out a thick, heavy accordion folder, meticulously labeled Family Liabilities, and dumped its contents onto my mahogany desk. It was time to perform a ruthless financial anatomy on the parasites living off my blood. Let us start with my brilliant older brother, Julian. Julian loves to parade around the exclusive tech hubs, claiming he is the visionary founder of a revolutionary software startup. He wears designer suits, hosts flashy seminars, and constantly boasts to gullible investors about his proprietary cloud architecture, the satirical, pathetic truth hidden in these legal files. His supposedly groundbreaking company does not own a single physical or virtual server. Zero. When he launched his application 2 years ago, he burned through his initial seed money in exactly 4 months. To prevent his entire platform from crashing into total oblivion and humiliating him publicly, I stepped in. Currently, 100% of his user data, his entire operational backend, and his hosting infrastructure are secretly piggybacking on a top-tier premium enterprise cloud account. That specific account is legally registered under my name, bound by my personal financial guarantee, and billed to my corporate credit card for a staggering $42,000 every single year. Legally speaking, Julian is not a visionary tech giant. His entire operation is nothing more than a digital squatter living rent-free in my server basement, utterly dependent on my goodwill to keep his digital lights on. Then there is my darling younger sister Stella and her fabulous new cosmetics empire. 3 years ago, my mother came to my apartment crying dramatic theatrical tears begging me to help my little sister. She claimed Stella was on the verge of a massive entrepreneurial breakthrough, but was getting crushed by unfair tax burdens and expensive trademark registration fees. So like a compliant, duty-bound fool, I did the heavy legal lifting. I established a custom limited liability company. I personally filed the complex trademark paperwork with the federal government. I structured the entire business model to ruthlessly optimize their tax liabilities, creating a perfect legal loophole, just as my mother had pleaded. The grand ironic result of that favor is sitting right here in black and white ink. Stella's name might be elegantly printed on the glossy pink packaging, and she might boast to her millions of followers about being a self-made business owner, but my holding company possesses the absolute uncontested legal rights to her brand name, her logo design, and her proprietary chemical formulas. Without my ongoing legal authorization, Stella does not own a cosmetics line. She owns nothing but a massive, legally unsellable inventory of tinted colored water in expensive glass jars. And finally, the absolute crown jewel of their shared delusion, the magnificent lakeside mansion my parents love to show off. They host lavish garden parties, sipping premium imported wine on the expansive terrace, acting exactly like old money aristocrats who have never known financial struggle. But if you dig up the county property records, you will find a glaring, humiliating inconsistency. My parents' personal credit scores were completely obliterated over a decade ago due to my father's catastrophic gambling debts and his disastrously failed real estate investments. No reputable bank in the entire country would lend them a single dime. The primary mortgage deed for that sprawling estate bears exactly one name as the primary borrower and legal guarantor, Chloe Reynolds. They are not wealthy aristocrats. They are, for all legal intents and purposes, my financially illiterate tenants occupying a luxury property I secured strictly because they were far too financially toxic to do it themselves. I stood over the desk, staring down at the mountain of lease agreements, intellectual property certificates, and bank statements. Looking at the cold, hard legal jargon, the psychological manipulation of the past 30 years became crystal clear. Every single time they needed a wealthy guarantor, a silent investor, or an impenetrable legal shield to protect them from their own staggering incompetence, they would suddenly weaponize the concept of family. They would smile warmly and tell me that blood is thicker than water. They would preach that family members must support each other unconditionally. But as I traced my own signatures on the documents, a freezing, liberating realization settled deep in my chest. I was never truly loved. I was never cherished as a daughter or respected as a sister. I was simply granted a conditional license to exist within their orbit because I was exceptionally useful. I was their designated human shield, purposefully kept around solely to absorb their massive legal liabilities and quietly finance their pathetic delusions of grandeur. In that quiet, sterile office, the residual sting of my mother's cruel joke at the dinner table completely evaporated into nothingness. The dull, heavy ache of familial rejection was instantly replaced by something much colder, much sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the precise, calculating instinct of an apex predator locking onto its prey. They had confidently, publicly mocked the very architect of their entire existence because they fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic of our relationship. They truly thought they had permanently chained me to the bottom of their sinking ship. They entirely failed to realize that I was the only person holding the keys to the lifeboats. I did not just want to block their phone numbers and walk away quietly into the night. Walking away would leave their fake glittering empire standing intact. know my emotions had completely transitioned into the sharp focus of a corporate hunter. I was going to surgically, mercilessly remove every single load-bearing pillar I had ever built for them. I decided right then and there to pull the plug on their entire financial life support system and watch their magnificent sandcastle inevitably collapse under its own hollow weight. I did not spend that weekend crying into a silk pillow or aggressively scrubbing my apartment to work off any nervous, anxious energy. There was absolutely zero screaming. There were no dramatic, tearful phone calls venting to my girlfriends about how unfairly I had been treated. Instead, my spacious living room systematically transformed into a highly tactical corporate war room. By 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, my senior corporate attorney, an absolutely ruthless, brilliant man who officially bills at $900 an hour, was sitting directly across my long dining table. We drank strong black coffee and worked in a deeply satisfying, entirely clinical silence. The only sounds echoing through the high ceilings of my penthouse were the rapid rhythmic clattering of our laptop keyboards and the continuous mechanical humming of my heavy-duty laser printer churning out stacks of devastating legal documents. We were essentially orchestrating a perfectly legal, financially ruinous heist in reverse. I was not plotting to steal anything from them. I was simply preparing the exact legal mechanisms to take back every single foundation that rightfully belonged to me. We started the surgical extraction with Julian. My brother fundamentally misunderstood how enterprise cloud architecture contracts actually function in the real world. I instructed my attorney to draft a formal legally binding revocation of service notice. Because my corporate premium account technically designated Julian's startup as a temporary third-party guest entity, I possessed the sole absolute authority to revoke his digital credentials instantly and without justification. But I chose to grant him just enough rope to publicly self-destruct before his precious investors. We logged into the back-end administrative console and manually instituted a strict 48-hour automated digital countdown. In exactly 2 days, at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, his entire administrative access would be entirely revoked by the system architecture. The main servers would automatically freeze all incoming and outgoing web traffic. His customer databases would lock down completely, and every single user attempting to open his supposedly revolutionary application would be greeted with a sterile generic error message indicating a catastrophic failure of payment and permanent server termination. We meticulously drafted the official termination notice, citing a critical breach of our internal usage terms, effectively cutting the technological umbilical cord to his entire artificial empire. Next on the meticulous chopping block was Stella and her shimmering, totally artificial cosmetics kingdom. I pulled up the primary operating agreement and the federal registration certificates for the holding company I had established for her exactly 3 years prior. I instructed my lawyer to prepare an incredibly aggressive, airtight cease and desist order regarding the intellectual property. Since my holding company legally owned the registered trademark, the exact color palettes of her branding, and the specific chemical formulations of her top-selling beauty products, Stella had technically been operating under a deeply informal, unwritten licensing agreement. With one stroke of a heavy black pen, we legally dissolved that informal goodwill. Accompanying the brutal cease and desist document was a meticulously calculated invoice for retroactive brand royalties. We assessed a standard industry licensing fee of 15% on every single beauty item she had successfully sold over the past 36 months. Adding compounded late penalties processing fees and standard administrative charges, the final printed invoice totaled an absolute staggering $250,000. If she wanted to keep her logo, her brand name, or even the basic right to legally sell the massive inventory currently sitting in her rented commercial warehouse, she had to pay that specific invoice in full within exactly 14 business days. Otherwise, I would file a federal injunction to legally seize her remaining stock and liquidate it to the highest bidder to cover the debt. Finally, we addressed the ultimate crown jewel of their shared delusion, the sprawling, overly decorated lakeside mansion my parents proudly occupied. This required a slightly different, much more bureaucratic weapon to completely dismantle: I drafted a formal notarized declaration of withdrawal of financial guarantee and submitted it directly to the automated risk management department of their primary mortgage lender. In this highly specific legal document, I cited a sudden critical shift in my personal corporate risk tolerance and formally requested to be entirely removed from the massive loan obligation. Now, major financial institutions do not simply let a wealthy guarantor walk away without severe immediate consequences. My formal withdrawal automatically triggered a mandatory non-negotiable critical risk assessment clause hidden deep on page 42 of the original dense mortgage contract. This automated trigger forced the bank to immediately order a full aggressive reappraisal of the physical property and, infinitely more importantly, issue an immediate threatening demand letter to my parents. This specific letter required comprehensive, fully audited proof of independent sufficient income to sustain the massive monthly payments. Knowing their personal credit history was essentially radioactive and their actual verifiable income was absolutely zero, this calculated move guaranteed the bank's automated system would aggressively initiate pre-foreclosure proceedings within a matter of mere days. By late Sunday afternoon, the silent, meticulous audit was finally complete. I gathered all the freshly printed legal threats, the ironclad revocation contracts, the highlighted bank statements, and the glaring red invoices. I organized these financially devastating papers into 3 thick, heavy manila envelopes, carefully writing Julian, Stella, and mother and father on the fronts in neat, thoroughly professional handwriting. There were absolutely no sentimental, tear-stained letters included inside. There were no emotional paragraphs explaining my hurt feelings or begging them for apologies. I only included cold, undeniable numbers and rigid, inescapable legal clauses. The pure lethality of these envelopes lay entirely in their absolute lack of emotion. They were mathematical silent death sentences for their respective illusions. On Sunday night, the apartment was perfectly quiet once again. My lawyer had gone home heavily and happily compensated for his weekend of absolute brilliance. The 3 thick envelopes sat perfectly aligned on my polished kitchen island right next to my closed laptop. I poured myself a generous glass of vintage red wine, watching the deep ruby liquid catch the dim ambient light of the sprawling city below. I stood completely still by the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking a slow, deeply appreciative sip. I allowed myself to fully enjoy this final profound silence. It was the deep, deeply satisfying calm right before the storm I had personally engineered swept through and absolutely leveled their entirely fake world. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when the synchronized detonations finally occurred, tearing through the pristine fabric of their lives with absolute merciless precision. The fallout did not happen gradually. It hit them all simultaneously, a perfectly orchestrated symphony of total destruction. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, Julian was standing confidently at the head of a massive polished glass conference table in the downtown financial district. He was in the middle of a crucial funding pitch to a room full of aggressive venture capitalists. He was sweating slightly but grinning, gesturing grandly toward the massive digital projector screen displaying his application interface. He was bragging about his supposedly revolutionary back-end architecture preparing to run a live simulation. Then the digital clock struck the hour. My 48-hour automated kill switch executed flawlessly. Mid-sentence, the vibrant graphs and live data feeds on his presentation screen violently glitched, stuttered, and instantly flatlined into a stark, glaring white screen. A massive red error box appeared directly in the center of the projection, entirely unavoidable and completely humiliating. The system displayed a brutal, unyielding message in plain bold text. Critical error. Server access permanently denied. Cloud hosting service terminated by owner. Julian frantically tapped his keyboard, his smug confidence dissolving into raw, public panic as the wealthy investors exchanged confused, highly skeptical glances. His global network was not just down. It was completely erased from the internet, leaving him standing there looking like a complete fraud. Exactly 10 minutes later, a completely different flavor of chaos consumed Stella. She was sitting in her perfectly lit, heavily sanitized bedroom studio, broadcasting a live unboxing video to nearly 80,000 simultaneous viewers. She was holding up a newly manufactured jar of night cream, flashing her perfectly whitened teeth, and rambling about her journey as a self-made entrepreneur. Suddenly, the aesthetic harmony of her broadcast was violently shattered. An urgent, legally binding cease and desist email from my legal team bypassed her management and landed directly on the tablet she was using to read live comments. At that exact same second, my automated copyright strike officially processed through her primary e-commerce platform. Her loyal viewers immediately flooded the live chat, typing frantically that her entire digital storefront had completely locked down. Her website now displayed a bleak generic legal takedown notice regarding a hostile intellectual property dispute. Stella stared at her screen, her perfectly contoured face draining of all color. She broke character, entirely dropping the expensive glass jar onto her desk, her eyes wide with absolute unfiltered terror as her primary source of income evaporated in front of a massive live audience. While my siblings were publicly drowning in their respective professional arenas, a much quieter but infinitely more devastating bomb arrived at the lakeside estate. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a uniformed postal worker walked up the long, perfectly manicured driveway and handed my mother a thick, heavy envelope, requiring a mandatory signature for certified delivery. It was the formal communication from the primary mortgage lender. My parents sat together on their sunlit terrace, slicing into fresh fruit, expecting perhaps a standard banking statement. Instead, my father opened the document and read the aggressive, non-negotiable demand. Due to my immediate legal withdrawal as the sole financial guarantor, the bank was instituting a critical risk protocol. They demanded concrete, heavily audited proof of sufficient independent income, or alternatively, a mandatory immediate deposit of $100,000 in cash within exactly 7 days to maintain the current mortgage terms. If the funds were not secured and fully cleared within that precise time frame, the bank would officially initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings and immediately seize the property. The grand illusion of their aristocratic wealth was instantly shattered by a single terrifying piece of paper. By noon, the full crushing reality of their collective situation had thoroughly settled in, and the desperate retaliation began. My personal cell phone, resting face up on my sleek office desk, started to light up like a distress beacon. It began with a few confused text messages from Julian asking if there was a glitch with the server payments. Then came the frantic, breathless voicemails from Stella begging me to call her back immediately because her store was broken. When the afternoon rolled around and I maintained my absolute icy silence, the tone drastically shifted. The polite confusion rapidly devolved into pure, unhinged desperation. The messages turned into long, rambling paragraphs of pleading. Then finally, as the realization of my intentional sabotage dawned on them, the communication turned incredibly vicious. My screen continuously filled with dozens of aggressive curses, vicious insults, and desperate legal threats from my father. They called me a monster. They demanded I fix what I had ruined. I sat perfectly still in my pristine, soundproof glass office at Aegis Vanguard Solutions. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal blazer, holding a cup of premium black tea, completely insulated from the raging inferno I had casually ignited outside. I calmly directed my team to handle a minor public relations crisis for a corporate client in Europe, entirely unbothered by the endless stream of missed calls lighting up my personal device. I simply reached over, toggled the phone to complete silence, and turned the screen face down against the cool wood of my desk. They were completely surrounded by a raging fire of their own making screaming into the void, and I explicitly chose to let them swim in that sea of flames without offering even a single drop of water, let alone the massive life preserver bearing my name. The rapid collapse of their house of cards could not be contained within the family group chat. The social and professional fallout spread like a highly contagious virus by late afternoon. Prominent technology journalists quickly picked up the story of Julian's disastrous presentation, publishing scathing, deeply humiliating articles questioning the actual legitimacy of his entire company and mocking his sudden catastrophic failure. Meanwhile, Stella's crucial business partners and aggressive wholesale distributors began rapidly pulling out of their agreements, publicly demanding immediate financial compensation for breached contracts, while her legal team scrambled hopelessly. The magnificent, perfect illusion they had spent 3 decades building on my back had completely crumbled into dust in a matter of hours, leaving them naked, completely broke, and entirely exposed to the unforgiving reality of the real world. By Wednesday afternoon, my deliberate communication blackout finally drove them to the edge of absolute madness. Since they could not terrorize me through a mobile device, they decided to physically invade my professional sanctuary. My sleek desk phone chimed with a direct line from the ground floor security desk. The head guard informed me in a tight, uncomfortable voice that 3 highly agitated individuals were currently screaming in the main lobby, demanding to see me to make me fix my terrible mistake. I did not panic. I did not hide in the executive restroom. I calmly instructed the guard to issue them temporary visitor badges and escort them directly up to the 42nd floor. However, I explicitly ordered that they be placed in Conference Room B. This specific room is a massive, highly intimidating box made entirely of soundproof floor-to-ceiling glass. It sits squarely in the center of the open-plan floor. Dozens of my junior analysts and corporate associates could clearly see every single movement inside, but they could not hear a single syllable. I wanted my family completely visible, entirely exposed, and totally stripped of their ability to manipulate the narrative. I grabbed the 3 thick manila envelopes from my desk drawer, smoothed my tailored blazer, and walked unhurriedly toward the glass cage. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, the visual contrast was almost comical. The polished, aristocratic facade they had paraded just a few days ago at the cosmetic launch was completely obliterated. Julian looked physically sick. His expensive tie loosened, and his hair a chaotic mess. Stella was wearing massive dark sunglasses indoors, likely hiding eyes swollen from hours of crying over her ruined social media empire. My mother and father looked aged, carrying the heavy, frantic energy of cornered animals. The second the glass door clicked shut, sealing us in complete acoustic isolation from the outside office, Julian exploded. He slammed both of his palms violently against the polished slate table. "You absolute traitor!" Julian hissed, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You humiliated me in front of the biggest venture capitalist in the city. I am going to sue you for corporate sabotage. I am dragging you into federal court, Chloe. You are going to pay for every single cent of the valuation you just destroyed." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let his empty threats hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air. Sensing that Julian's aggressive tactic was completely failing to intimidate me, my mother immediately pivoted to her favorite weapon. She began weeping loudly. Real heavy tears streamed down her perfectly powdered cheeks. She reached out desperately, trying to grab my hand across the table, but I smoothly pulled it back. "Chloe, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling with weaponized maternal agony. "We are your family. We share the exact same blood. How can you be so incredibly heartless? You are pushing your own flesh and blood to the absolute brink of total ruin, and for what? Because of one silly, thoughtless joke over dessert. It was just the champagne talking, darling. You cannot destroy our entire lives over a simple misunderstanding." I stared at her tear-stained face. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation that used to instantly guilt me into total submission now felt like watching a poorly acted play. "Let us cut the pathetic theatrical performance," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. I raised my hand and tossed the 3 heavy manila envelopes onto the center of the slate table. They landed with a loud, definitive thud that made Stella physically jump in her chair. "I am not destroying anything," I stated calmly, looking precisely from one terrified face to the next. "I am simply taking back what belongs to me. Let us review the exact numbers, shall we?" I pointed directly at Julian, whose face had suddenly gone pale. You cannot sue a landlord for changing the locks when you never paid a single dollar of rent. Your entire digital infrastructure was running on my personal enterprise account, costing me $42,000 every single year. You are not a chief executive officer. You are a highly expensive parasite. The servers belong to me. I simply turned my own property off. I shifted my gaze to Stella, who was now gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were completely white. And you have exactly 14 days to pay the $250,000 you owe my holding company in retroactive licensing fees. If you try to sell even one more jar of that cream without paying me the 15% royalty rate we legally outlined in the cease and desist order, my lawyers will legally seize your warehouse. You do not own an empire. You own a massive debt. Finally, I turned my attention to my parents. They looked utterly paralyzed. And the house. The bank requires $100,000 in liquid cash within 7 days because your personal credit scores are absolute garbage. Without my signature acting as your golden shield, you are officially bankrupt. I did not put you on the brink of ruin. You have been living in ruin for an entire decade. I was just the one quietly paying the massive cover charge. The sheer crushing weight of the legal reality finally collapsed heavily onto the room. The blustering anger entirely evaporated instantly, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying silence. They stared at the 3 envelopes as if they were live explosives. My father, desperately clinging to the fading ghost of his patriarchal authority, stood up straight. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the booming, commanding voice he had used to terrorize me during my childhood. "Enough of this absolute nonsense, Chloe," he barked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "I am your father. I command you to call your lawyers right now. You will call the bank. You will turn Julian's servers back on. You are going to fix this terrible mess immediately, and we are going home to discuss this like a proper family." I did not blink. I slowly stepped closer to the table, completely ignoring his desperate display of fake dominance. I bypassed him entirely and locked my eyes directly onto my mother's terrified, trembling face. I leaned in, ensuring my voice was low, perfectly measured, and utterly lethal. "You said something deeply profound at that beautiful dinner party." I whispered the words, slicing cleanly through the heavy silence of the room. "You looked at me, and you wished I was never born." My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, violently shaking her head, as if trying to physically erase the memory of her own cruel words. "Well," I continued, offering her the exact same empty, chilling smile I had given her right before I walked out of that dining hall, "I am just making your ultimate wish come true. Since you prefer a perfect life with only Julian and Stella, you can now have exactly that. From this exact second forward, financially, legally, and personally, I do not exist." Before any of them could formulate a single word of protest or beg for a final shred of mercy, I stood up straight. I turned my back to them, raised my hand, and signaled directly through the transparent glass wall. The 2 large, heavily muscled security guards standing by the elevators immediately nodded and began walking briskly toward the conference room. I walked out of the glass door, not looking back even once. I left them standing entirely frozen in the center of the transparent cage, surrounded by the busy corporate world, staring down at the thick piles of legal documents that officially dictated their imminent, inescapable bankruptcy. You would think the crushing weight of reality inside that glass conference room would be the final chapter of this miserable saga. You would assume that cornered animals, finally presented with the undeniable proof of their own failure, would simply retreat into the shadows. But narcissistic delusion is a remarkably stubborn disease. Exactly 3 weeks after the building security escorted them out of the lobby, I received a formal legal summons. Julian, driven by pure, unadulterated ego and a desperate need to save face in the competitive technology community, had somehow convinced a highly aggressive attorney to officially file a massive civil lawsuit against me. The primary charge was the malicious destruction of corporate property. He was demanding $10 million in financial damages, publicly claiming my sudden server shutdown intentionally destroyed his proprietary algorithms, and ruined his corporate valuation. He even leaked the pending lawsuit to several prominent technology blogs, hoping the public threat of a corporate sabotage scandal would terrify my executive board and force me into a quiet, highly lucrative financial settlement. He truly thought he was playing brilliant three-dimensional chess. He did not realize I had already built the board, written the rulebook, and entirely rigged the game. I never even bothered to hire a defense attorney for the civil suit. I simply sat back in my office chair, drank my morning tea, and watched the beautiful mathematical inevitability of federal law take its natural course. Here is the fatal arrogant flaw in Julian's aggressive legal strategy. When you publicly sue someone for the malicious destruction of a multi-million-dollar technology company, you are legally required to prove to the federal courts and your financial backers that your company was actually worth that exact amount of money in the first place. By officially filing that lawsuit and crying sabotage, Julian unknowingly triggered an automatic mandatory financial audit by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal financial regulators marched right into his rented office space to meticulously verify the damages he claimed I had caused. What the federal investigators found hidden in his private ledgers was not a tragic victim of corporate sabotage. They found a massive, undeniable Ponzi scheme masquerading as a legitimate startup. The strict federal audit explicitly revealed that Julian had been systematically fabricating active user engagement metrics to secure subsequent rounds of venture capital funding. He had been quietly funneling hundreds of thousands of investor dollars into his own offshore bank accounts to sustain a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. But the legal blade he had so eagerly sharpened to stab me in the back slipped cleanly, cutting his own throat. The presiding judge immediately dismissed the civil lawsuit against me. Instead, Julian found himself formally indicted on 14 federal counts of wire fraud and investor embezzlement. The last update I received indicated he was facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He was completely, utterly annihilated by his own arrogant hand. With the golden child now facing federal prison time, the remaining family dynamic instantly disintegrated into a toxic pit of absolute betrayal. Without my steady flow of money to act as the social glue they violently turned on each other. My mother loudly blamed Stella for being too greedy. Stella viciously blamed my parents for raising a criminal and ruining her reputation by association. The bank officially foreclosed on and repossessed the lakeside mansion, forcing my parents to hurriedly move into a tiny rundown 2-bedroom apartment on the dusty outskirts of the city. Stella was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, her entire cosmetic inventory seized and auctioned off for literal pennies to cover her massive, insurmountable legal debts. While they were busy tearing each other apart in the bitter ashes of their fake kingdom, I quietly packed my bags. I requested a permanent professional transfer to Aegis Vanguard Solutions' newest corporate branch, located in the rainy, incredibly peaceful city of Seattle. Leaving the East Coast entirely was the final necessary step in severing the infected limb. Within 6 months of arriving in the Pacific Northwest, I officially resigned from the corporate firm and launched my very own independent risk consulting agency. I built a brand new life completely from the ground up. Much more importantly, I built an entirely new circle of friends. I surrounded myself with brilliant, fiercely loyal individuals who genuinely respect my mind and deeply value my authentic self. They never ask me to pay a hidden financial toll just to be allowed to sit in the room. I am no longer a human shield or a silent, unappreciated financier. I am just me. The ultimate realization of my freedom hit me on a quiet, rainy Friday evening. I was sitting alone at a small, dimly lit corner table in a high-end French bistro downtown. The polite waiter approached and placed a delicate gold-leaf chocolate tart directly in front of me. It was the exact same type of dessert that had been served at Stella's launch party all those chaotic months ago. The very same dish that accompanied the cruelest joke of my entire life. I picked up my silver dessert fork. I looked around the elegant, peaceful restaurant. There were no manipulative parents demanding my credit card. There were no parasitic siblings claiming my hard work as their own. And most importantly, there was no mocking, humiliating laughter echoing in my ears. I took a small bite of the rich chocolate, and a genuine, profound smile finally reached my eyes. I realized then that the most perfect absolute revenge was not about violently silencing their cruel laughter. The truest revenge was ensuring that I would never ever have to hear that terrible sound again for the rest of my natural life. Thank you so incredibly much for listening to the conclusion of my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please kindly let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our channel with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the description or the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our hardworking staff a fair wage so they can feed their families and continue creating these wonderful stories for you to enjoy. Have a beautiful, peaceful day.